This is Upwell, a new podcast from Only.one, featuring entrepreneurs, advocates, and leaders working to protect and restore the ocean and the planet. And I'm your host, Aaron Kinnery. Today we have Amy Vitale, a National Geographic photographer, filmmaker, writer, speaker, and the founder of Vital Impacts, who has committed her work to illustrating the connection between people and nature. Let's dive in. Amy, thanks for joining Upwell. I wanted to start with a moment early in your career when you spent half a year in the West African country of Guinea-Bissau, which is one of the poorest countries on earth. And you wrote that on your last night there, sitting under the stars with a group of children, one of the kids looked up and asked you something. Can you share that story?
Oh, I can. It's actually, it's something I think about every month, and I'll explain it why. So I had shared and lived with a family and a village, and got to know people, very well over 6 months. Learned the language, And when I say that it was an impoverished place, I like to change that a little bit and just give some back context. Like, they did not have all the material things that maybe people in the West have grown so comfortable with, but actually there was a beautiful richness, and I don't mean that to sound cliche. They just really transformed how I see the world, because there was this beautiful reverence for nature, and that they understood that everything that they needed and to survive came from the natural world. I mean, nature was their supermarket, and they taught me so much about my own ignorance and how rich their lives are. And so that was the back story. And then on my last night, I was sitting underneath a sea of stars, and there's this big, beautiful full moon, and Alio and all the children were asking me a million questions about my return home to America. Do you have mangoes in America? Do you have cashews? What are you going to do when you get home? And then Alio looked up at this full moon and asked me, "Do you have a moon in America?" And I promise you that there is not a full moon that goes by that I do not think about Alio. And I've thought so much about the moon as a metaphor a lot since then. And when you think about it from its perspective, looking down on our shared life raft here, this planet, you start to understand that oneness, that there is, from its perspective, there are no borders, that we are all so intricately connected in this big, beautiful web. And that story and that experience has guided me in all of my work and reminded me that I should always talk about the challenges that we face right now, but how important, how essential it is to also remind all of us that we are intricately connected in a web, whether we understand it or not.
And there's something so incredibly touching in this moment of this innocent curiosity and commonality. And I wonder, what are some of the other lessons that you've learned from people you've met in all corners of the world?
Oh, I think I've been really, really humbled and realized that sometimes, I'm a journalist. I love to do all my research and read everything I can before I go to a new place, even if it's a new community in my backyard. I want to learn everything I can. And I think that's a wonderful thing to do. But I think it is so important also to remember the danger of thinking you understand somebody's story. I think that we should always go with the listening attitude wherever we go, and to remember that, it takes time to truly understand one another and hear one another's stories. And once you do, once you take the time to really listen and be patient and let people open up and share with you, that's the only moment when you'll really be transformed, when you really, I guess the things I've learned is just to to take a quiet attitude and let people share with you. It's really essential, especially in today's world where we have so much information flying around.
And I know you've seen some of these characteristics and some of the deep connection you talked about between people and nature in your own backyard in Montana. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, I see it everywhere.
It's incredible. And I know over the course of your career, you visited more than 100 countries and had countless encounters with incredible people and wildlife. And throughout all of it, you've often remarked that your photography illustrates how interconnected we all are, people and nature, different species of wildlife with each other. And so I just wanted to discuss a few of those examples. Can you share the story of Sudan and his keeper, Joseph, and how that experience impacted you and your work?
Oh, yes. And actually, it's a whole community of people protecting these animals. But may I back up even a little bit farther?
Of course.
And so I actually was really always very interested in stories about the human condition. And I wanted to understand really why wars happen, why there's so much suffering on the planet. And this kind of led me down this path where for the first 10 years of my career, I was a war photographer and I parachuted into, every kind of conflict unfolding. I was 26 when I began. And for 10 years, I really focused on the horrors of the world. That's what I was kind of asked to do. And I had this profound turning point, actually pretty early into covering the suffering of the world, and began to realize that that we are not separate from nature, and that all these conflicts I had been covering were always somehow connected to nature. They're not disconnected. Basically, all of these conflicts, almost all of them, you could start to understand they were about our resources. And that when our ecosystem starts collapsing, and whether it's water or scarcity of any other kind of resource, it can often really lead to the demands placed on our ecosystem often drive conflict and human suffering. So I started to really make this connection and realize that if I talk about the human condition, I also must talk about the natural world and what we're doing to it, because they're not something separate. And so all of that thinking started happening around the same time I had the opportunity to meet these northern white rhinos that were in a zoo in the Czech Republic, about to make a journey all the way back to Africa, because it was this last ditch effort to save the entire species from extinction. So on this day in December of 2009, if you can imagine, there were only 8 northern white rhinos left on the planet, and they were all in zoos. At least these were the known rhinos. I mean, maybe there's some northern white rhinos out in the wild, but people have not found them. And so when I saw these creatures, I just literally felt like I had just seen unicorns. I mean, you look at them and you see that they have been on this planet for millions of years. They look like prehistoric creatures. And it just seemed so unfair that we had reduced an entire species to these creatures. They're just like these hulking, gentle, beautiful animals that were just surrounded by factories in the zoo outside of Prague. And in the beginning, it was like this, when I heard about the story, it almost sounded like a Disney cartoon, like animals return to the wild. But actually, when I met them, it literally stopped me in my tracks and broke my heart. And I could not believe that we, mankind, had reduced them to this. And so I knew at this moment, this was like all of these things started happening in my life and made me realize that I needed to do a 180 and start to include stories about, these keystone species that our lives depend on them. You cannot just remove these animals from the wild and think that the ecosystem is going to be fine. And that, I just started to understand that our futures and all of this interconnection that I've been talking about before, with just humanity, also it impacted wildlife. And so I really began to then seek out stories, because I felt like at the time when I began this story that we focused so much on the story of poaching, and so much needed attention was focused on the wildlife and fighting the poachers. And I also started to ask this question, like, well, what about the people, the indigenous people who live with these wild animals? What do they think? And I never heard about them in any of the stories that I was, reading and working on. And I just began to ask that question, and it led me down this rabbit hole of finding the most amazing stories that really give you a lot of hope for the planet, because you start to realize a lot of good things are happening too, and that we actually can change the course, the trajectory that we're on right now, by supporting the indigenous communities who live with the wildlife.
And I do want to pick up on that a bit with another story. We've heard recently about how communities have been impacted by the recent disruption of supply chains caused by coronavirus. And you had a story about the impact that had on baby elephants in northern Kenya and the unlikely allies next door. Can you tell us a little bit about this story and how the shift that transpired also helped local communities?
This is one of my favorite stories. So basically, there is the Vitale Elephant Sanctuary in northern Kenya, which is one of the first was the first indigenous owned and run elephant sanctuary in all of Africa. And they really began to get concerned in the middle of the pandemic. What do we do if the supply chains break down? Because they were buying very expensive powdered human milk formula, which is what they kept the baby elephants alive with. And they said, what happens if we can't get the milk formula? So they began to experiment and look around and said, like, what could be a plan B for us? And they realized that the goats eat the same browse that the elephants do. So they started experimenting using fresh goat milk. And it ended up being not just a great plan B, but it turned out being one of their greatest discoveries, because they went from a 50% survival rate of those baby elephants using human milk formula to a 98% survival rate of all those brand new babies that come in. They're so vulnerable. These are the hardest moments to rescue them. And so I love it. It's like goats to the rescue. All of a sudden, the goats are now saving the baby elephants. And then another piece of the story, which I love, is that the women who are the ones that own the goats and, sell the goat's milk, all of that money that was going to a multinational company outside of the country is now staying inside the community. And I went with the women when they opened bank accounts for the first time in their lives. These are indigenous Samburu women, never had a bank account in their life, never had extra money to save for a rainy day. Now they're able to send their kids to school. They're able to send, family members to the hospital. They have a savings, and it's giving them, greater stake in, their own futures. It also helps them see the value of the wildlife that they coexist with, the elephants. And it's just like one of these powerful stories that reminds me, when we're all going through perhaps the most difficult moments of our lives. I know that people are suffering right now. It is not an easy time. But I like this story so much because it reminds me sometimes it is in these moments of our greatest challenges that it allows us to reimagine a different way forward. Because guess what? They never would have thought about changing the milk formula if this hadn't happened. Everything was going fine, like there was no reason to change things. And I just think that we should all remember that and use it as a metaphor in our own lives, because I just believe that, doing the impossible is, it really requires rewriting old narratives, rewriting old ways of doing things, and realizing that, the impossible doesn't always fit with the current narrative. You have to start recasting and seeing things in a different way. And that take these moments right now to transform our future and reimagine a different way of doing things.
It really is this remarkable story because you had this pandemic that left many people feeling isolated, and yet it also underscored the interconnected nature of people and wildlife, of the individuals within the community. And so it's a fantastic example, I think, of the point that you make so often about just how interconnected we really all are. And I loved learning about the Vitale Elephant Sanctuary, and in particular about this young elephant named Shaba in your documentary. Can you talk a little bit about what Shaba taught you and the Samburu woman leading the sanctuary?
Yes. So one other piece of this story, I've been, very close with the community before they even started the sanctuary, when everybody laughed at them and told them it was an impossible dream. They didn't have the political power or the funding to make it happen. But when I met them, I knew they would do it. And one of the parts of this story that is also very special is that they are the first Indigenous sanctuary that hires Indigenous women to be elephant keepers. And that was really revolutionary at the time. Women taking care of elephants, nobody was doing it. And it turns out some of the women are the best elephant keepers. And I love this story because it's not just a story about how people relate to the wild around them, but it's also a story about how people relate to one another. And then the other piece of this story in the film kind of alludes to this, but, the keepers always tell me it's not just us saving the elephants. The elephants actually saved us too. And, I think that is what partnerships in this world really mean. It's like we all need to take care of each other. And the film kind of hints on that. And, if people are interested, we offer $10 downloads, and we've already raised over $200,000 just with $10 downloads of this film. It's a short film. It's deeply inspirational. And I think it gives us a lot of hope in the world and reminds us that, the future is about really taking care of one another, having empathy for one another, and how powerful that can be.
And I just want to touch on one last story, really, to underscore the importance of partnerships. You had a story where you had two communities alongside Kenya's Lake Baringo that were in conflict for decades, and they finally reached a truce, and they came together to bring back the wildlife that was displaced by their conflict, starting with the Rothschild's giraffe. Can you share a little bit about this effort and the work to protect giraffes across Africa?
Oh, yes, this is another wonderful story. So yes, I think a lot of people don't really realize it, but the giraffes, they're calling it a silent extinction because they too are in trouble. We usually group giraffes as one giant species, but there's a lot of subspecies. And for example, the West African giraffe, they were down to only 49 individuals in 1996. 49. And because of communities coming together and, great conservation with governments and conservation organizations, there's over 600 of them today. So, never give up. It's always possible to make changes. But yeah, the story back in Kenya was about how the climate actually is changing, and these giraffes were moved far away from humanity to this peninsula. And they thought that it would keep them safe. But basically, the climate started to change. The water, they were on this lake, and the water levels had been slowly rising over time. But in 2020, torrential rains caused severe flooding. The rains were relentless. The lake was rising 6 inches every single day. And then these 9 giraffes became stranded there. This peninsula turned into an island, and there were very limited resources available for them. And it was especially grim for one giraffe named Asiwa, who was stuck on this marshy part of the island, totally separated from the other giraffes. She had about an acre of land to forage for food from, and she was living together with hippos, crocodiles, poisonous snakes, and a few happy little warthogs. But every day the flooding was getting worse and worse, and time was actually really running out for Asiwa. And the Rothschild giraffe, they in Kenya, I believe they hold 10% of the population of Rothschilds, and I think there's less than 2,000 of them in the world. And so she needed to be rescued, and these conservationists save giraffes, and then Ruko Conservancy and the Kenya Wildlife Service, and they all came together, and they had this plan to kind of coax them onto this handmade raft that they lovingly called the giraffe. Ah ha ha. And, so they tried to coax them, but that didn't work. And they eventually had to dart and tranquilize Asiwa and 8 other giraffes. They eventually moved. And it was a dangerous thing. It's not easy to, giraffes are really vulnerable. Once you dart them, you have to immediately capture them and then counteract that drug with a reversal drug, or they could die. And so it was a really dramatic move. And they did it. They put a blindfold on her, socks were put in her ears, and they got her on this raft, and then it kind of, puttered across the lake with this red speedboat. And then she was, released. And I think this story was so critical because, the Rothschilds have lost about 80% of their population in the last 30 years. I just want to say that one more time because that is shocking. 80% of the population in 30 years. So it's one of the most imperiled subspecies of giraffe. And it's really because of habitat loss for the most part. And it was a successful move. And now the hope is that they can start reintroducing other giraffes back into their historical home across the Western Rift Valley in the next 20 to 30 years. But there's amazing projects happening. And I guess my thinking is that let's not wait until it gets so dramatic that we have to do these really extreme things to save species. We actually have a lot of hope if we start making, saving habitat a priority. And yeah, it was a wild story. And, I just feel like I hope everybody listening, instead of feeling despair, go and get engaged, because there's so many beautiful things we can all be doing in our backyards to make a difference.
Well, you certainly have been advancing action, and one way that folks can get engaged is by getting involved with your work with Vital Impacts. Can you talk a bit about the mission and vision of the organization?
Oh, absolutely. So I started this nonprofit during the pandemic because I was feeling a little bit of despair, just not knowing what I could do. And I realized that I think that we are all so much more powerful together. And so I rallied together some of the finest photographers and artists on the planet who have a deep commitment to the natural world and asked them to contribute their work. I even got Jane Goodall to get involved, and she has donated hand-signed prints that she photographed. I mean, people don't really realize, but Jane is a beautiful photographer too. And so I have her work, and I've partnered with her, and we raise money through these print sales. But also I've built out programming now, and we've just announced two $20,000 grants for photographers and storytellers to work on a long-term project about the natural world. And that is available to anybody. They can apply for it. And I have a mentoring program where I'm pairing up some of the best conservationists and environmentalists and photographers to support the next generation of environmental storytellers, because I think we need to do more to empower one another. And so my nonprofit is really about creating opportunities for the people who are actively engaged in the future of the planet, and also, create a marketplace for people to get inspired by. Really, some of the work is totally exclusive. I've spent a long time kind of curating, reaching out to artists. Some are really established artists, some are unknown, but the work is really quite extraordinary. And it's just such an honor to be able to collaborate with so many people.
And you've had really incredible results and scaled in such a short period of time. What are some of the organizations and efforts you've been able to support through this endeavor?
Yeah, well, this next one I'm partnering with Jane Goodall's Institute, Roots and Shoots. And in the past, in our first 6 months, we raised $1.5 million. We supported 4 nonprofits that are working with the environment, and those were Jane Goodall's Roots and Shoots. It was Big Life Foundation, which works in East Africa, and Great Plains Foundation, and Sea Legacy. And then we also did a print sale for Direct Relief, because I was so profoundly impacted by the conflicts unfolding all across the planet. And I mentioned earlier, I see the breakdown and wars being directly related to our resources and the planet. And so we raised over $850,000. We sold those prints and sent that money to Direct Relief, and they send supplies to people caught in the middle of conflict. So yeah, that's a little bit about that. And we're in the middle of a sale right now. If anybody wants to get engaged, or even, just get inspired by the work or apply for a grant. I mean, the idea is just to create a community around caring for the planet.
And I know you also have a year-long storytelling mentorship for 40 Indigenous Kenyan conservationists. How has this helped to scale that impact?
Yeah, well, so I have been working in Kenya for a long time, almost, 20 years now, and with a couple of communities very closely for a long time. Vitale is one of them. And so I always felt like it was such a privilege to be able to share their stories with the world. And I have this awesome platform of working for National Geographic. But also I realized that, the people whose stories I'm sharing, they should also be the ones telling their own stories. And who gets to tell the stories really matters. And so I wanted to empower them, give them the tools to start working on their own stories. And so they all are taking pictures, and I'm mentoring them and kind of getting on Zoom calls and checking back in. And we created a Instagram account with the 40 conservationists. It's called wild.lifeincolor, and its color is spelled the British way, COLOUR. And it's, you can follow along on their journeys and get engaged with the work that they're doing. But I really feel so strongly that, we should all equally have platforms to sharing stories, and that it should not just be kind of me, an outsider coming in it's wonderful to be able to tell those stories, but I feel a deep sense of responsibility to make sure that those voices are also telling their own stories.
That's incredible. And I will be sure to leave links to the Instagram and also to the winter collection in the show notes, and be sure to share it on social media as well. Final question, Amy. You've witnessed extreme conflict, and you've also seen examples of incredible cooperation. And I wonder if there are any insights on humanity you might have from these two contrasts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we will always have, it's challenging on this planet, and I think that no human does not have challenges, and they often seem so formidable and like there's nothing you can do. But I would just say that it's so important to stop playing those narratives in our head that say, the problems are too big to solve. I'm just one individual. What can I do? I think the single most powerful thing all of us can do for ourselves and for the planet is to start rewriting those narratives in our heads and start asking the question, what can I do? What can I do to get more engaged? And to believe that, instead of filling our minds and our hearts up with the negative, toxic stories they do exist. I mean, it's undeniable. And it's, but I also think that the other stories are equally undeniable, that I have had the privilege of witnessing great changes, great transformations that really fill your heart up. And I think it really begins by, again, I keep saying it, but recasting the narratives in our head. And I guess my final parting thought to everybody is like, find your own passion, whatever it may be, and go out and make a difference in your backyard, in your family, in your life. Like, you all of us have a role and a responsibility in a way to just, take a baby step and get involved, and you'll be surprised. And the other thing that it does is it actually makes you feel good. It's kind of selfish in a way, but it actually feels really good to get engaged and get to know people and find community and find a way to help all of the critters and the plants and things that we share this planet with. Yeah, that's all.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for committing your words, your photos, your time, and your talents to reminding each of us of the role we each have, and really the shared story, the shared future, the shared responsibility we all have to working with each other to create a more vibrant and equitable future. So I really appreciate you taking the time today, and I really am grateful for the lifetime you've committed to this work.
Oh, I'm so grateful for you taking the time and offering this. Thank you, and thanks to everybody listening too.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much, Amy, for sharing such uplifting, inspiring reflections from your many travels and encounters over the years. I'll leave links to where you can find Amy and Vital Impacts in the show notes, which you can find at only.one/Upwell. Once again, that's only.one/Upwell. This week's episode was engineered by Jake Bowles, research was supported by Serena Cooper, and our cover art was designed by Joanna Marcus at Only.one. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and start your journey to help save the ocean and fix the climate today at only.one. For as little as $9, you can start planting coral and mangroves and removing plastics and carbon. Again, that's www.only.one. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with an all-new episode of Upwell.